debated several amendments in the bill. Here's a portion of the debate.
I rise to offer Amendment 4.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Thank you.
Amendment number 40, printed in Part C of House Report number 117-125, offered by Ms. Ocasio-Cortez of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 667, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to offer Amendment 40 to reduce the Pentagon budget by 10%. During a time when our country is withdrawing from foreign wars, when COVID-19 and its fallout is one of the greatest threats that we face, when record levels of unemployment, housing, and health care crises are among us, the United States should be reducing its military spending by at least 10% and prioritize the very needs of our communities here at home. Today, we can cut the defense authorization by 10% without any need to deny our service members or their families any of the support that they need. And in doing so, we can free up to $77 billion to go towards fighting the COVID-19 pandemic and much more. Mr. Speaker, I urge support of this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from New York reserves the balance of her time. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield myself such time as I may consume. I rise in opposition to the bill.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment would strip $79 billion out of the bill. That would have catastrophic effects on our training and readiness. I need to remind y'all, we've been at war for 2 decades. We've worn out everything we've got. We've got to start replacing and modernizing for the future to be able to take on the threats from China and other adversaries. This will set us back on cleanup and environmental remediation of PFAS and other contaminated items. It would put off construction of new military housing, schools, and child care facilities, and the list goes on. I urge all members to oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, there's a point brought up that this could potentially threaten our readiness, and I would counter that it is not the readiness that cutting our defense budget threatens. It is the profit margins of defense contractors. In fact, almost every major defense contractor here in the United States has had to pay fines or settlements for fraud or misconduct, all while getting about $1 trillion in public funding in defense contracts. I have seen this personally in my work on the Oversight Committee, where we have encountered contractor after contractor gouging the public and draining our resources. In fact, the $77 billion is not even that hard to find. The Pentagon could save almost $58 billion by eliminating obsolete weapons like Cold War-era bombers and missiles designed and built in the last century that are completely unsuitable for this one. We could find another $18 billion by simply preventing the end-of-year spending sprees that lead to contract money being shoveled out the door every September. In fact, the Congressional Research Service has documented these spending spikes, and you could set your watch to it. Each September, as offices at the Pentagon go on last-minute spending sprees to justify next year budget increases. We have increased our military spending year after year, senselessly and needlessly. And now again, during a time when we have ended an almost 2-decade war, there is no reason for us to be increasing our military spending and our defense budget when we are not funding child care, health care, housing priorities, and the climate crisis here at home. And I reserve my time.
Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill does everything the lady just talked about. We are investing in those items that she just talked about, and we are divesting ourselves of those $78 billion worth of legacy platforms that will not be useful in the future, and we're applying that money toward those future platforms. In any event, right now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield a minute and a half to my friend and colleague and an outstanding member of the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Desjardins of Tennessee.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for a minute and a half.
I thank the ranking member. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to the Pocan Amendment. A 10% cut to this budget will leave America vulnerable to our adversaries. The United States is facing daily threats from China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, and a whole host of other bad actors. We must fully fund our military so that the U.S. has every capability necessary to deter those who wish to do us harm. The fiscal year 2022 National Defense Authorization Act has bipartisan support from the House Armed Services Committee already, with the approved budget on the floor today being $23.9 billion more than the bare-bones budget that originally came through. There's a reason why the improved budget was approved in a bipartisan vote of the committee by an overwhelming 57-2 margin. Modernization is an important part of our military strategy. Our military leaders have spent the past year sounding the alarm in testimony before Congress that our top competitors, Russia and China, are working at a startling pace to close the gap between themselves and the U.S. in areas like nuclear modernization. In other areas like hypersonic capabilities, they may have already surpassed us. This budget is absolutely necessary in order to maintain advantages over our enemies as technology continues to evolve and change rapidly. Now is not the time to recklessly cut what we must spend to protect our country and provide for our men and women in uniform. We must ensure our brave men and women in the armed services have every resource necessary to keep the American people safe. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Alabama reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the Pentagon is the only federal department that has never passed an audit, despite this requirement being on the books for over 30 years. You know, there are folks who are supportive of the current levels, the increased and skyrocketing levels of defense spending, saying we are already meeting all of our needs with this. I don't think a single American, I don't know a single member of my district that can say that our child care needs are being met in this country, that our health care needs are being met, that our climate action that is necessary is being met. Our needs are not being met. And despite all of this rhetoric about the deficit and all this fear about government spending, for some reason, our defense budget seems to be exempt from this conversation, and that we ask Americans and people in this country year after year to engage in the magical thinking that defense spending comes at no real cost. It does. It comes at the cost of our security, because when we do not have and we are not able to go to school, to go to work and count on childcare for our children, it makes us less safe. When we're not able to go to an emergency room or have our health care covered, we are less safe. The degradation and erosion of our social systems here domestically is a threat as well. And it is coming at the cost, that is happening because of our explosion in defense spending.
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would point out that achieving or meeting the objectives that the gentlelady just outlined and defense are not mutually exclusive. We can do both and should do both. And I would point out that the $3.5 trillion that your side is proposing doesn't spend a dime on defense. And also, we are in the process of auditing. You're exactly right. The Defense Department's never passed an audit. This bill continues the pressure on them to get that complete. We have had many agencies that passed, not all have, and we're not going to let up until they pass an audit. This time I'd like to yield a minute and a half to the ranking member of the Military Personnel Subcommittee and Armed Services Committee, an outstanding leader in our committee, gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher, a minute and a half.
I thank the
gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for a minute and a half.
I thank the ranking member. Earlier this year, and I rise in opposition to the amendment, which I think would be very destructive. Earlier this year, the former head of Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Phil Davidson, warned that the Chinese Communist Party could make a move on Taiwan within the next 6 years. Within the next 6 years, we could be facing a crisis unlike anything we've seen in our lifetimes. This assessment was concurred by the Chief of Naval Operations, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and the idea that we're going to do an across-the-board 10% cut, an indiscriminate across-the-board 10% cut to the Pentagon at a time when we're facing a serious national crisis, I think makes absolutely no sense. The ranking member pointed out the irony and tragedy that the other side is proposing to spend $3.5 trillion on social welfare spending and then telling us that we have an explosion in defense spending when defense spending as a percentage of GDP is still at lows relative to what we spent during the Cold War. Does anyone seriously believe that by releasing a press release or engaging in a security partnership with the Taliban, we've somehow ended a war? Does anyone seriously believe that the struggle against Salafi jihadism is somehow over because we've surrendered in that struggle? Absolutely not. And the reason and the irony that defense spending has gone up, if you even compare the Obama cut in real terms to the Reagan defense buildup, it's not because of missiles or ships or bombs. It's because of increasing personnel costs, right? It's healthcare and retirement costs. So as an empirical matter, what you're arguing is simply not true. And as for spending too much money on defense, what costs a lot of money is when you stumble into war on someone else's terms. And the best way to do that is to project weakness. Weakness invites aggression. We can achieve peace only through strength.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Alabama reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think what we have just experienced and seen in our last two-decade war is exemplary of the types of waste that goes on, where what we see is a lack of oversight. What we see is runaway military contractor spending with little oversight in what is going on. And then folks are caught surprised on the end that all of this investment seems to not have panned out in the way it has not been invested in the way that that the American public was led to believe all along. Now, not only is that cost, are these tremendous costs that we had laid out earlier, but also this explosion in spending leaves our public health priorities underfunded and militarizes every problem in our society and turns peaceful protesters into targets of weapons at war. I urge support for this amendment.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment guts our bill, which is, I'm certain, the gentlelady's intention. It is recklessly irresponsible. It would harm our service members and their families. I strongly urge all members to oppose it. Now I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to House Resolution 667, the previous question is ordered on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New York. The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to request the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 41, printed in Part C of House Report 117-125. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to offer amendment number 41 as the designee of Ms. Lee.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Jacobs of California.
Amendment number 41, printed in Part C of House Report number 117-125, offered by Ms. Jacobs of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 667, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Jacobs, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Jacobs.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
This amendment, offered by my friend and colleague Congresswoman Barbara Lee, restores the NDAA to the original funding level requested by the White House, the Pentagon, and the chair of the Armed Services Committee. Specifically, it would remove the Rogers Amendment, which increased the pending authorization by $23.9 billion. When Mr. Rogers' amendment was offered during committee markup, I voted against it, and nothing over the last few weeks has led me to change my mind. Mr. Speaker, just 3 weeks ago, we ended our military operations in Afghanistan, America's longest war, and one that started when I was in middle school. And yet, what some are concluding from that is that what we need is more war, more weapons, and billions of dollars more than even what the Pentagon themselves are asking for. So many of my colleagues who supported Mr. Rogers' amendment note the emerging threat from China as their reason to support this increase, even though very little of this increase is even relevant to China, and most national security experts agree that making needed domestic investments is far more important to our competitiveness with China. Instead, this inflated budget seeks to sugarcoat that for years we've been decreasing investments in diplomacy and the support of our service members in favor of purchasing new, unproven, and unneeded weapons. We need to have an honest conversation about the Pentagon budget and focus on what is achievable, what the real threats are, and what we actually need for our national security. For the last 20 years, we've been told we need more. But I think it's time to recognize that there are simply not military solutions to every problem. I thank Congresswoman Lee for offering this amendment. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. For what purposes? Gentlemen seek recognition.
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself 2 minutes. Mr. Speaker, here we go again. This time they're stripping $25 billion in funding added by Republicans and Democrats on the committee. The gentlelady argues that the Biden budget is sufficient for our national defense. I strongly disagree. The Biden budget constitutes a cut of about $4 billion in real spending from last year. The budget cuts the number of Navy ships, and destabilizes the industrial base. It slashes procurement across the board. It guts missile defense. It leaves unfunded $25 billion in combatant commander priorities. And it cuts the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. At least they left the Space Force alone. It does all this while our adversaries, especially China, are investing in military modernization. China increased its defense spending by over 75% over the last decade, 6% this year alone. They're leapfrogging us in capabilities like AI and hypersonics. And they're stepping up malign operations against America and our allies. What's the president's response to this? He proposes a budget that would cut funding for programs that we need to deter China. It doesn't make sense, especially when he's proposing to swell non-defense spending by a massive 16% this year. This bill corrects that. I urge all members to oppose this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the esteemed chair of the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Adam Smith.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to get the numbers clear here. The budget proposed by President Biden was $753 billion. And by supporting this amendment, we support President Biden's budget of $753 billion, which was a $12 billion increase over last year's budget. Last year's budget, the last budget from the Trump administration, only increased the defense budget that year by $3 billion. So a $3 billion increase last year was perfectly acceptable to my Republican colleagues in the House and Senate under President Trump. A $12 billion increase this year is not. So the numbers are being dramatically just presented here as some kind of cut, when it's actually a bigger increase than Trump did in his last year in the White House. Let me make clear, I see the threats. And I do agree more with my Republican colleagues on that point. I don't support the previous amendment that does a $75 billion cut, because I understand the threat environment, and I know that we need to modernize to meet that threat environment. But the other thing I see is decades of waste and wasteful expenditures on programs like the F-35, on the Ford-class carrier. Can I get an additional 30 seconds? Sorry. We spent money in a very imprudent way. We have got to instill discipline at the Pentagon so we get value for the dollars that we spend. Simply giving them another $25 billion does not do that. $753 billion is enough. It's even better if we actually start spending it wisely, intelligently, and effectively. That doesn't happen if we're never, I'm a little short. Can you just give me a little more money? I always love the Winston Churchill quote, "Gentlemen, we're out of money. Now it is time to think." That is the type of discipline that we need at the Pentagon, not just to give them a blank check every time they ask. The president's budget is sufficient to meet our needs. I urge support for the amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield a minute and a half to a real leader on the Armed Services Committee, the ranking member of the Sea Power Subcommittee, Mr. Whitman of Virginia.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Republican leader. Similar to the previous amendment, I believe this amendment is extremely misguided. In fact, in March 24th of this year, I invited both Mrs. Lee and Mr. Paucan to attend a classified brief on the existential threats we face in great power competition. Mr. Speaker, instead of taking me up on that offer, they continue to turn a blind eye. The chairs of the Defense Spending Reduction Caucus don't want to learn about what the threats are. They don't want to learn more about the critical capabilities that would be out of the hands of our warfighters if this amendment were to pass. I can stand here and tell that caucus about how this plus-up has $9.8 billion in procurement that's aimed directly at deterring China. That means building additional ships, among other capabilities, to keep up with China. Or I can tell them that there's $3 billion for sustainment operations that allow our warfighters to conduct global operations, including humanitarian operations in places like Haiti. Or I can tell them that there's $3.8 billion for military construction to improve facilities in districts across the country to make sure our service members aren't working in rundown facilities. I can even tell them there's $5.2 billion for research and development that assures our future service members will have what they need to, when called upon, to do the job or to fight to victory and come home safe. But I don't think any of that's going to resonate because these progressive members don't want to learn about the existential threats we face. These far-left members just want to play progressive politics, and that means weakening our national security. To the rest of my colleagues here today, this plus-up is good for national security and good for this country. You can ask any service branch chief or combatant commander because we've asked them, and they've told us these are the things that they need going forward. I strongly urge everyone to vote against this amendment, and I yield back.
Mr. Expired gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Can I inquire how much time I have remaining?
Gentlewoman from California has 1 3/4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Alabama has 2 minutes.
Thank you. I yield 1 minute to the distinguished representative from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I rise in support of Amendment 41, which would cut $25.5 billion from the defense authorization bill. Now, there were some accusations just now saying that this is about progressive politics, but this bill allocates $25 billion more than President Biden even requested. So what we should be doing is sticking to the plan, giving the President of the United States what he determines is necessary for defense spending and not a dime more. And I yield back to the gentlelady from California.
Gentlewoman from New York yields back. The gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time I'd like to yield 1.5 minutes to one of our outstanding freshmen in the Armed Services Committee from the great state of Alabama, Mr. Carl.
The gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to oppose this amendment. You know, there's several different ways to look at this amendment. The budget that we got from the president was before our problems in Afghanistan. We're asking for $25 billion to replace $80 to $85 billion we left on the ground for Taliban to fight us back. So I asked that we keep an open mind on replacing that equipment, if nothing else. It is critical to pass this bill, which includes bipartisan increase. I repeat, bipartisan. How many times do you hear that word? I've been here for 9 months, and I can probably count that on one hand. Bipartisan increase in spending to counter threats and project the U.S. strength around the world. This amendment would limit readiness and the needed capabilities to counter these threats. Passage of this amendment would basically shortchange our military at a time when they need our support more than ever. I'm proud to have worked on this bill with my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to ensure that our military is fully funded for our men and our women in uniform and the resources they need to protect and defend the United States of America. Folks in my district in South Alabama work hard every day to support the military readiness of this country. Unlike President Biden and his allies in Congress, Alabamians understand how important it is to fully fund our military. I urge my colleagues to support our armed forces and oppose this amendment. Sir, I'll turn my time back to you.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, reserves. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I'm prepared to close. No?
The gentleman from Alabama has the right to close, so the gentlewoman is recognized.
Okay, great. I hear my colleagues on the other side talk a lot about the needs from Afghanistan. What's interesting is that in the continuing resolution that this body passed just yesterday, there was additional supplemental funding for Afghanistan, and yet my colleagues on the other side of the aisle decided to vote against it. I also hear them talk about the threats and the briefings that supposedly we were not in. I sit on both the Foreign Affairs and Armed Services Committee. I assure you, I've been to every single one of those classified briefings on the threats. I am very aware of the threats. But we need to dispel the notion that our ability to respond to the threats depends solely on the size of our military. I'm honored to represent San Diego, a proud military community, and they don't need a larger budget. They need one that takes their needs into account, which means better wages and housing free of mold, childcare and job opportunities for their spouses. And they need a government that goes through every diplomatic channel before making the decision to send them to war. Earlier this month, Vice Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Hyten, asked, "Do you think any taxpayer in this country would believe that for $700 billion a year, we can't have a great defense?" Hyten said, "We should be able to, and it's crazy that we can't." He's right. It is crazy, and more of us need to be willing to say what everyone knows is true. We don't need to spend money even the Pentagon themselves are not asking for. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The underlying bill before this body, the FY22 National Defense Authorization Act, would increase spending by 3% over inflation, which is a modest increase. And it passed our committee with an overwhelming bipartisan vote. This amendment guts the bill. I urge all members to oppose it, and I yield back the balance of my time.